You never really know who someone is until the system decides to test them in public. The afternoon sun over a small American gas station in Texas burned down on cracked asphalt and shimmering fuel pumps, creating a heat haze that made everything feel slightly unreal, slightly delayed, as if the world itself was watching before it reacted. Inside this ordinary stop on the edge of a highway, Olivia Carter stood beside a black SUV parked near Pump 3, her posture calm, her movements controlled, wearing simple civilian clothing that gave no indication of status or importance, only presence. She looked like any other traveler passing through, yet there was an unusual stillness in the way she observed everything around her, as if she was used to environments where attention could turn into judgment in seconds. Nearby, customers moved in and out of the convenience store, unaware that a small procedural moment was about to escalate into something far larger than anyone expected. Then came Deputy Mark Reynolds, arriving with the practiced authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, his uniform crisp, his expression fixed on early suspicion as his eyes landed on Olivia and stayed there longer than necessary. He approached with measured steps, scanning her vehicle, her posture, and her behavior as if assembling a case from fragments rather than facts. "Ma'am, step away from the vehicle." His voice carried the tone of routine enforcement. But the atmosphere around them tightened instantly, subtle shifts in attention rippling outward as nearby witnesses began to notice that something unusual was unfolding. Olivia did not react immediately, not out of fear, but out of control, as if she was choosing the exact moment to engage rather than being pulled into it. Her gaze met his briefly, steady and unreadable, before returning to stillness, which only deepened his suspicion rather than easing it. The gas station, once ordinary and forgettable, now felt like a confined stage where every movement carried weight, every silence felt intentional, and every second stretched longer than it should. Without raising her voice or resisting physically, Olivia simply asked one question that shifted the tone of everything. On what grounds? And in that instant, the interaction stopped being routine and started becoming something no one present would interpret the same way afterward. As Deputy Reynolds tightened his stance, unaware that the situation he believed he was controlling was already moving beyond his authority. The air above the small roadside gas station shimmered under the late afternoon heat, the kind of quiet place where nothing ever seemed important until suddenly everything did. And in that moment, even the sound of a closing car door felt louder than usual. Inside the parking lot, tension had already begun to form in invisible layers as two uniformed officers stood near a marked patrol vehicle, their attention fixed on a single woman who had just been asked to step away from her car for what they described as a routine verification. The woman, Naomi Carter, stood calmly beside the fuel pump, her posture steady, her expression controlled, carrying herself with a quiet confidence that did not match the assumptions being made around her. She wore simple travel clothing, a dark jacket, and carried a small handbag, appearing like any other traveler who had stopped briefly before continuing a long journey. The officers had arrived after a brief report regarding a suspected transaction irregularity tied to a payment mix-up at the station, and what began as confusion quickly escalated into suspicion as questions were repeated and identification was requested multiple times. Naomi complied without raising her voice, offering her identification and speaking with measured clarity, but the atmosphere around her tightened as if the situation had already been decided before she even arrived. Nearby, a few bystanders slowed their movements, sensing that something unusual was unfolding, though no one yet understood its full weight. One of the officers stepped slightly closer, scanning her documents again, while the other spoke into a radio, requesting additional confirmation from dispatch. The exchange remained procedural on the surface, but underneath it carried a growing imbalance of perception and authority that Naomi seemed to notice but did not react to emotionally. Instead, she maintained eye contact only when necessary, choosing restraint over confrontation, allowing each question to pass without resistance. As minutes passed, the stillness of the gas station contrasted sharply with the internal urgency building within the officers, who were now attempting to reconcile incomplete information with assumptions they had not yet questioned. Unknown to them, Naomi's identity was not just a matter of personal record, but connected to a chain of command far beyond the scope of a routine stop, though she made no attempt to reveal this prematurely. She simply waited, as if observing the situation from a distance, letting the moment develop its own weight. In the background, the hum of distant traffic and the flicker of overhead lights gave the scene an almost unreal stillness, as if time itself had slowed down to emphasize what was about to happen next. When the radio finally crackled again, the tone on the other end shifted subtly, introducing a level of urgency that had not been present before, and the officers exchanged a glance that suggested they were beginning to realize this encounter was no longer ordinary. Yet even then, the full truth of who Naomi Carter was remained just beneath the surface, waiting for the exact right moment to change everything. The moment stretched forward under the pale glare of the gas station lights, as Naomi Carter remained composed beside the fuel pump, her presence steady even as the environment around her began to shift in tone and intensity. The officers, still positioned a few steps away, were now fully engaged in verifying her information through their communication system, with one of them speaking in a lowered but increasingly urgent voice into the radio, while the other continued to observe her reactions carefully. What had started as a simple request for identification had evolved into a procedural delay that no longer felt routine, as fragments of confirmation began returning from dispatch in inconsistent intervals. Naomi did not interrupt or attempt to influence the process. Instead, she maintained a calm posture, her attention occasionally moving toward the horizon, where passing vehicles created brief streaks of motion before disappearing into the distance. The atmosphere around them became heavier, not through action but through anticipation, as if the environment itself was waiting for a decision that had not yet been spoken aloud. One of the officers stepped slightly back toward the patrol vehicle, reviewing details on a handheld device, while the other remained near Naomi, now speaking in shorter sentences that reflected growing uncertainty. Despite the pressure building in the moment, Naomi's demeanor did not change. She stood with controlled patience, offering only minimal responses when spoken to, each word precise and measured. A few bystanders at a distance had begun to slow down more noticeably, some pretending to check their phones while actually observing the interaction, sensing that the situation carried an unusual weight without understanding its origin. The radio communications suddenly became more active, and the tone from dispatch shifted from routine verification to something more direct, instructing the officers to hold the situation steady until further confirmation could arrive from a higher authority channel. This instruction immediately altered the behavior of the officers, who exchanged another glance that revealed uncertainty beginning to replace their earlier confidence. Naomi's eyes briefly followed the movement of the radio, but she still did not speak beyond what was necessary, as if she already understood that the situation was unfolding according to a structure that others had yet to recognize. In the background, the steady rhythm of the gas station continued unchanged, with the sound of fuel pumps clicking and distant engines passing by, contrasting sharply with the increasingly focused attention at the center of the scene. As another transmission came through, the officer closest to Naomi lowered his voice further, acknowledging that additional verification had escalated beyond standard protocol, though the exact reason had not yet been fully disclosed to them. The air between all parties felt compressed by the weight of incomplete understanding, and yet Naomi remained exactly where she stood, calm and unshaken, as if waiting for a final piece of information that would determine how the entire situation would resolve. The arrival of additional vehicles marked a decisive turning point in the unfolding situation at the gas station, as the previously local interaction transitioned into a coordinated federal response that reshaped the entire environment within minutes. Naomi Carter remained at the center of it all, still composed, still steady, her presence unchanged despite the rapid escalation of authority surrounding her position. The officers who had initiated the stop now stood slightly apart, no longer directing the situation, but instead observing as structured protocol replaced their earlier uncertainty. The newly arrived personnel moved with controlled efficiency, communicating through secure channels while establishing a perimeter that was calm but unmistakably formal in nature. Each action followed procedure rather than assumption, and every confirmation exchange through encrypted communication reinforced the seriousness of the identity being verified. Naomi did not move from her position near the fuel pump, and her silence carried a sense of quiet certainty that contrasted with the heightened activity forming around her. As the federal liaison officer approached, a brief exchange took place over identification credentials that had already been verified through multiple independent systems, and the tone of the interaction shifted immediately from inquiry to acknowledgement. The local officers were instructed to provide a full account of the initial stop, though the focus was no longer on suspicion, but on documentation of procedural escalation that had already exceeded standard jurisdictional boundaries. Naomi's file, now fully confirmed at the highest level, reflected a status that required immediate realignment of authority on site, and the implications of that confirmation became evident in the subtle but clear change in behavior among all personnel present. The air at the gas station, once ordinary and unremarkable, now felt structured by protocol and hierarchy that extended far beyond the physical location. Naomi's calm demeanor remained constant, her attention steady, as if she had anticipated this moment long before it unfolded. The federal liaison briefly acknowledged her presence with professional respect, signaling the completion of verification that had been pending since the initial radio escalation. The officers who had first made contact now stepped back further, their earlier certainty replaced by a more reflective understanding of how quickly situational perception could shift when incomplete information guided action. There was no confrontation, no dramatic interruption, only the quiet reordering of authority as systems aligned with verified identity rather than assumption. Naomi's role, once OB. The gas station had begun to return to its ordinary rhythm, yet the space where Naomi Carter had stood felt subtly different, as if the air itself had absorbed the weight of what had just been confirmed and then carefully released back into normality. The federal liaison team completed their final on-site verification steps with calm efficiency, exchanging brief acknowledgments through secure channels before signaling that the immediate review phase was complete. Naomi remained composed throughout the process, her posture unchanged, her expression steady, observing without interruption as the structured coordination around her gradually transitioned from active response to procedural closure. The officers who had first initiated the stop now stood at a respectful distance, their earlier uncertainty replaced with quiet reflection as they processed the sequence of events that had unfolded from a routine verification into a fully escalated federal acknowledgement. No further questions were directed toward Naomi, as her identity had been confirmed beyond all required thresholds, and the chain of command had formally assumed responsibility for any remaining documentation or internal review. The federal liaison briefly offered a professional nod of acknowledgement, signaling not only the end of verification, but also the recognition of her status within the system that had been activated in response to the initial report. Naomi responded with a simple, composed gesture, neither rushed nor emotional, as if concluding a process she had long been familiar with rather than one that had just been imposed upon her. Around them, the last of the additional vehicles prepared to depart, their presence fading as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind only the ambient sounds of the gas station returning to its everyday state. The local officers exchanged no further words regarding the incident, instead focusing on standard procedural logging, aware that the official record would now reflect a sequence governed entirely by verified information rather than initial assumption. As the federal team cleared the area, the structure of authority that had briefly reshaped the environment dissolved back into its usual hierarchy, leaving only the residual awareness of what had occurred. Naomi adjusted her grip on her handbag and took a small step away from the fuel pump, signaling the natural continuation of her journey. The moment no longer carried tension, but instead carried clarity, as if every participant had been aligned through a process that corrected itself once full information was available. She walked toward her vehicle with measured calm, her presence no longer the subject of scrutiny, but of silent acknowledgement. Behind her, the gas station resumed its normal flow of activity, yet the memory of the event lingered in the restrained movements of those who had witnessed it, a quiet reminder of how quickly perception can shift when truth replaces assumption at the center of a situation. Naomi Carter continued her walk toward her vehicle with steady, unhurried steps, the kind of movement that carried no trace of urgency despite everything that had just unfolded behind her at the gas station. The environment had already begun to normalize again, with customers returning to their routines, vehicles pulling in and out of pumps, and the faint hum of everyday activity resuming its place over the earlier silence. Yet for those who had been close enough to witness the sequence of events, there remained an unspoken awareness that something significant had occurred beneath the surface of what appeared to be a simple roadside interaction. Naomi reached her vehicle and paused briefly before entering, her presence still calm and composed, as if taking a final moment to close the chapter of the encounter without acknowledgement or ceremony. Inside the gas station area, the remaining officers completed their final documentation steps, their actions now purely procedural, guided by established protocol rather than interpretation or judgment. The federal liaison team had already departed, leaving behind only confirmation records and the formal acknowledgement that the situation had been resolved according to verified identity and jurisdictional correction. Conversations among bystanders were minimal and subdued, consisting mostly of brief observations rather than speculation, as the intensity of the moment had already been absorbed into memory rather than ongoing discussion. Naomi entered her vehicle and sat for a brief moment without starting the engine, her posture unchanged, her attention directed forward rather than backward, as if mentally transitioning from one phase of responsibility to another. The interior of the car was quiet, offering a contrast to the structured activity that had just concluded outside. When she finally started the engine, the sound blended naturally into the environment, no longer carrying any symbolic weight beyond ordinary departure. As she pulled away from the pump area, the gas station gradually returned to full normal operation, with no visible signs of the earlier escalation remaining except for the subtle behavioral restraint of those who had witnessed it firsthand. The officers remained in place for a short time after her departure, completing their reporting requirements and ensuring that all procedural entries reflected the corrected chain of events. There was no further discussion of suspicion or assumption, only acknowledgement of verification and jurisdictional transfer. Naomi's vehicle merged into the flow of traffic outside the station, continuing along the roadway with steady control, her presence now fully removed from the space where the misunderstanding had occurred. In the quiet that followed, the incident existed only as a completed record within official channels and as a quiet memory among those present, a reminder of how quickly a situation can transform when identity is fully confirmed and authority aligns itself with truth rather than assumption. The roadway stretched ahead as Naomi Carter continued her drive, the evening light shifting slowly across the windshield in soft, uninterrupted gradients that matched the calm rhythm of her movement away from the gas station. Behind her, the location where the incident had unfolded was already returning to its ordinary state, no longer marked by urgency or heightened attention, but by the quiet continuity of everyday activity. Inside the vehicle, the cabin remained still, with only the subtle sound of the engine and the steady motion of the road providing any sense of direction or progression. Naomi's expression remained composed, her focus forward, not on what had just occurred but on what came next, as if the previous encounter had been absorbed into a larger pattern of experience that required no reflection in the moment. The sequence of events that had escalated from a routine verification to a fully coordinated federal response now existed only as a completed process within official systems, recorded, verified, and closed according to protocol. For those who had been present at the gas station, the memory of the interaction would likely remain as a brief disruption in an otherwise ordinary day, marked not by conflict but by correction of understanding when full information had finally been introduced. Naomi's role within that sequence had been defined not by reaction but by presence, her calm consistency serving as the constant through which all other adjustments had occurred. As she continued along the highway, the environment outside the vehicle gradually shifted into the broader flow of traffic, with distant headlights appearing and disappearing in measured intervals, reinforcing the sense of continuity that followed her departure. There was no urgency in her movements, no indication of disruption, only a steady progression forward that aligned with the natural conclusion of the situation she had left behind. The systems that had activated in response to her identification, had already reverted to their normal state, with reports finalized and authority restored to its standard structure. Within those systems, the incident would remain documented as a procedural escalation resolved through verified confirmation, serving as a reference point rather than an ongoing concern. Naomi's presence in the narrative of the day had already transitioned from active involvement to recorded acknowledgement, leaving behind a clear outcome shaped entirely by the correction of assumption through verified truth. As the distance between her vehicle and the gas station continued to grow, the moment itself dissolved into the larger continuity of routine life, where only those who had been directly involved would fully understand how quickly perception had shifted when complete information was finally introduced into the situation.